Rise of Kingdoms has gotten its first new set of formations in the game. In today's video, we'll be covering the two newest formations, Circle and Testudo, where they should stand relative to similar formations of their type, as well as in the formation meta in general. But without further ado, let's get started. First, let's talk about the one that is getting the most attention, and that's Testudo. Testudo has a base stat of 5% less damage while shielded and 2.5% boosted healing. As a base value, it's very decent, but it is shield dependent, so it's not going to naturally benefit players like Hollow Square does. And it will have a natural conflict with Hollow Square due to the shielding specialty and the shielding specialty inscriptions they have. Next, for the codex itself, let's talk about the stats on the specialty inscriptions. First, we have a 3.5% boost to shields, a 10% chance to increase the strength of all shields and healing by 3%. This is good. Like I said, 3.5% boost to shields and healing is good, although it is very niche because there's not as many healing commanders. And with a 10% chance to increase the strength and healing even further, whenever you launch a basic attack, that means when you're getting swarmed, you're more likely to get this trigger. Next, we have a 5% boost to counterattack damage, super useful. Whenever the troop receives a shield or is healed, the strength of the shield is increased by 7%. This is pretty good. It is, again, 7% boost to shield, which is pretty solid. Whenever you're receiving a shield, and that's going to be consistent, it is a 5-second cooldown. So if you have a double shield, you're only going to get one of these affected, which is kind of a sting, especially when you want to make the most of the shield boost on everything else on their kit. This kind of conflicts with it. Next, we have 5% skill damage resistance, and then whenever their troop is healed or receives a shield, it's 3.5% bonus to damage for 5 seconds on an 8-second cooldown. So this is great if you have a lot of heals and shields. 3.5% damage bonus is nice. It's not quite the wedge skill damage, but it's all damage, so that helps counteract that, and it's actually very beneficial. The last skill is just a flat 7% boost to healing and 7% boost to shields. This comes out to 17.5 to 24.5% shield strength, depending on what triggers are going off. 20 to 27% healing strength, depending on what triggers are going off. 5% counterattack damage, 5% skill damage taken reduction, and that 3.5% damage boost for 5 seconds every 8 seconds when you're shielded. As a final verdict, it's great for shielding commanders. It really does need double shields to make the maximum use of it, but then you have that natural conflict on the second one where you have the boost and then it's on a cooldown. So that is a little bit frustrating, but overall, when you look at all the other combos, it is very nice and it is very consistent in terms of the overall bonuses you get. And it does have a nice balance because you do have shields that get boosted and heals that get boosted. Although it does somewhat fall a little short because the healing commanders are not as prevalent in the meta as shielding commanders, and shielding commanders already have a pretty small niche as is. But overall, the combination is pretty good. Next, we're on to Circle Formation. Before we get started on Circle Formation, I do want to make a slight correction to the Testudo section. The Testudo shield and heal bonuses are both between 17.5 and 24.5, but depending on what triggers. I want to make a correction on that because some of the text is not super clear, so I wanted to clarify on that. But now that we're on to Circle Formation, we have a base stat of 5% healing boost. That's twice as good as Testudo's heal boost, but without the damage reduction when shielded. So as such, it's still pretty solid, but it is pretty much only for healing commanders instead of healing and shielding commanders. But now let's go into the actual specialty inscriptions. First one we have is 5% counterattack damage, and then after a skill you get a 10% boost to healing for the next 3 seconds. This is super useful. It does trigger off of Zenobia's 1100 damage factor healing, because that happens in a second after the primary skill. So this will be active during that, in theory. So that would be a huge boon for her, which boosts that 1100 healing factor to 1210, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's more healed troops, which is super useful. There is a chance it doesn't line up with Constantine's passive because his is unit count based instead of trigger based. So that's something to be concerned with, but that is something to be covered a little bit in the future here. Next, we have a 5% boost to healing, which is solid for the healing kit. Whenever the troop takes damage, it has a 30% chance to increase healing further by 10%. Again, 3 seconds uptime on 5-second cooldown. It's pretty good. You get a pretty decent uptime. And if you have healing commanders, it can be definitely useful. But outside of healing commanders, it's not going to do as much for you. Next, we have a 5% skill damage resistance and a 5% bonus to damage dealt when you are healed. This is super useful. You get a 5-second on an 8-second cooldown. So if you can get your skills consistently going, you can really get a 63% uptime or so on it, depending on how you round, which is very, very much going to benefit you because the actual 5% bonus damage dealt is straight up. It's not just skill damage, it's not normal damage, it's all damage. So that's something that's super great. And then the skill damage resistance is also excellent. Lastly, we have just a straight 10% boost to healing received. So overall, you get a 5% counterattack. You get 10% healing boost after skill, 5% skill damage resist, 5% damage when healed, up to 63% uptime, 15% flat healing, and then 10% heal boost when damaged. That means you get 15% on flat, and if you happen to be using an active skill and get damaged and trigger that one, that jumps up to 35% healing. So that is a pretty big range of healing boost. And big, bulky defenses that are going to get swarmed are going to be able to be using more active skills and have more healing and be damaged more, which means you get more healing boosts. So it does have potential in garrisons, but it is held back by the fact that outside of Zenobia and Constantine, you don't really have a lot of heavy healing garrisons. And Constantine is a one-time trigger, more or less, when you're talking about the major heal that he has when he hits a certain unit count. So that is something to be concerned about as well. Zenobia does have the benefit of it being 1 second after the active skill technically, so it should be active when you have the actual trigger of the major 1100 factor heal. So that's something to consider. But when you look at Constantine, you do have less damage, but the actual heal here is just a 7500 heal factor that goes up to 15,000, which is great. But you gotta hope it lines up with right after an active skill and right after you're taking damage. Otherwise, you're really not going to get a lot of utilization out of it. So that's something you have to consider as well. So the line between Testudo and Circle is pretty straightforward. If you're having shields, Testudo's better. If you just have heals, Circle's better. But what about Testudo versus Hollow Square? With similar inscriptions, Testudo and Hollow Square share similar goals, making them naturally something you're going to want to debate. So we're going to go over which one's really better for which situation. For the sake of time and clarification, stats that are the same or are essentially the same, I'm going to skip over, and we're just going to be talking about what the edges are. So first, in the base stats, Hollow Square's 2% straight damage reduction. Testudo is 5% damage taken while shielded, and that 2.5% heal boost. For these cases, commanders without shields or heals will have better luck with Hollow Square, while commander pairs with shields that can maintain an uptime of 40% or above of their shields for a combat will be better off with Testudo, or with near 40% shield uptime and a heal of some sorts. Next, for inscriptions. Testudo has edges statistically around with 10% more shield strength, the additional 17.5 to 24.5% more healing, and 5% more counterattack. This means Testudo is better with healing commanders, with white damage, and with basically the both of them combined with the likes of Zenobia, for example. Conversely, Hollow Square gives 5% straight damage reduction, as well as 10% skill damage reduction when shielded, more than what Testudo does. So in a commander without heals, the choice comes down to a 10% shield strength and a 5% counterattack damage, or a 5% damage reduction and 10% skill damage reduction when shielded, which really leans towards hollow square overall. However, commanders with significant heals will get a bunch of bonus value from the additional healing, while major shielding comes out to close to a wash. But it's worth noting that shields have been growing at a slower rate than damage factors, so straight damage reduction on a 2200 damage factor skill would be more significant damage taken off the table than a 10% damage boost on a 1200 damage factor shield. Ultimately, though, the difference is only super significant for Rally and Garrison, so if you're using this in the field, the difference is likely minimal due to march size, so the choice is going to be up to you, and especially in the field, it's going to come down to what you have the better armaments for. Lastly, I wanted to touch base on where Testudo might really shine in the current meta. Testudo and Hollow Square are relatively similar. It results in endgame once you get set up and established, particularly when you don't have any heals on your commander. But there's one commander pairing, or set of pairings, that seem to stick out to me when I see Testudo as an ideal option. That's Gorgo Xeno. You take Xeno's incredibly solid heal, part of why she's had the longevity that she's had alongside the health boost on her skill. Boost it by 20% or more depending on the situation in the inscriptions, which Hollow Square does not do. Next you have Gorgo's expertise with a shield and a boost that significantly as well, with the additional 17.5 to 24.5% shield boost. On top of tons of damage resistances and other bonuses in their default kit, they can take use of the when they're healed or when they are shielded combination, because both of them will contribute to that. Similarly, Gorgo Hera and Xeno Hera will have similar benefits, with Hera's larger 1200 damage factor shield having a higher uptime than Gorgo's passive 500 damage factor shield. These all stick out as great options for Testudo, and if there was a pair that the formation was built for, it's one of these three definitely that come to mind. However, any commander pairing that can utilize shields as well as heals, or just significantly large of either of them, will make great use of Testudo over Hollow Square, and that's really where they're going to significantly shine in the niche. But with that, we will wrap up our discussion on Hollow Square and Testudo. With these being the first real expansions of formations, I felt like it warranted a full video to touch on how they stack up to what's there, and maybe even open up a window into what the developers might be envisioning, both for the current and the future meta with these expansions. But let me know in the comments, who will you be pairing with Testudo or Circle? Who do you think will make a sneaky good pairing or might bust into the meta with this sneaky combination of inscriptions? Do you want to see me cover a different video topic? Let me know down in the comments or join the Discord to vote there. But as always, good luck, fight well, and I will see you on the battlefield.